There are moments in life when everything feels like it's slipping away, when dreams fade, hope flickers, and even the simple comfort of a loyal companion feels too far out of reach. But sometimes when we least expect it, the smallest glimmers of kindness can ignite miracles we never saw coming. Today we invite you to step into a story of quiet strength, unexpected blessings, and the kind of love that endures beyond hardship. A story that begins with a simple wish and leads to a life forever changed. Before we dive in, if you believe in the power of kindness, second chances, and stories that warm the heart, we'd love for you to join our community. Hit subscribe and stay with us for more journeys that remind us. Even in the darkest winters, hope finds a way. Now let's begin. A poor mechanic's last wish was to see his dog, but what happened next changed his life forever. The early winter sun barely pierced through the heavy Montana clouds, casting a muted gray over the cracked concrete of Walker's auto repair. Inside the small, cluttered garage, the air smelled of motor oil, rust, and the sharp tang of cold metal. Ethan Walker wiped his hands on a tattered rag, peering under the raised hood of a battered Chevy truck. The engine coughed as he turned the ignition once, twice, then gave up with a resigned sigh. "You and me both, old girl," he muttered, patting the fender. From the corner, a soft thud sounded. Ethan turned, and there he was, Rusty, his golden retriever, padding toward him with the slow, stiff movements of old age. Rusty's muzzle was frosted with white, his steps cautious, but his tail still wagged with unwavering loyalty. Ethan knelt down, despite the creak of his own tired knees. "Hey, buddy, you keeping me company?" he whispered, ruffling the thick fur around Rusty's neck. The dog pressed his forehead against Ethan's chest, and for a moment, the chill of the winter air seemed to lift. In this small world of grease-stained overalls and broken machines, Rusty was the one constant that made everything else bearable. Above the garage door, the ancient bell clanged weakly. Mr. Harris, the owner of the shop, and Ethan's boss, landlord, and, in many ways, surrogate father, shuffled inside, a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You're still at it?" Harris called, voice roughened by decades of cigarette smoke and life's hard edges. Ethan smiled faintly, standing, trying to coax a few more miles out of her. Harris glanced at Rusty, then at Ethan, his expression softening. "Take it easy, son. Don't push yourself too hard." Ethan only shrugged. Work was work. Bills didn't pay themselves, and Rusty needed his meds more now than ever. "Truck's due by noon," Ethan said instead. Harris hesitated, then tossed a manila envelope onto the nearby workbench. "Got some bad news this morning. Rent's going up next month. Just $50, but—" His voice trailed off. He didn't need to say the rest. They both knew $50 might as well be 500 when you had nothing left to squeeze. "I'll figure it out," Ethan replied, masking the tight knot forming in his chest with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded and left, the bell jingling again behind him. The garage fell into silence once more, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the loose metal siding. Ethan leaned over the truck, his breath clouding in the cold air. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper, something he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. He brushed it off. He always brushed it off. Rusty gave a low whine, and Ethan turned to see him lying down, his body curled tightly, his breathing shallow. Concern prickled at the back of Ethan's mind. "You okay, boy?" he murmured, crouching beside him. Rusty's eyes opened, cloudy but trusting. Ethan rested his forehead against the dog's, willing strength into both of them. It was just another day. That's what he kept telling himself. The afternoon dragged on, each repair feeling heavier than the last. By dusk, a thin layer of snow had begun to dust the ground. Ethan finished bolting the Chevy's hood closed and wiped his brow, his breath rasping harder than it should. He bent to lift his toolbox, but a sudden sharp pain shot through his chest. His vision blurred. The concrete floor tilted alarmingly beneath him. "Rusty!" he gasped, reaching out blindly. Then the world tilted entirely, and Ethan crumpled to the ground. Rusty barked, a weak but urgent sound, dragging himself to Ethan's side. He nudged Ethan's face with his nose, pawed at his chest. No response. The garage door slammed open moments later. Harris stood in the doorway, horror freezing him for a beat before he rushed forward, shouting for someone, anyone, to call an ambulance. Rusty never left Ethan's side even as the paramedics arrived and surrounded him. As they loaded Ethan onto the gurney, Rusty tried to follow, but the paramedics gently pushed him back. "Sorry, boy," one of them said softly, giving Rusty a regretful pat. "Hospitals don't allow dogs." Rusty sat there, ears drooping, watching helplessly as Ethan disappeared into the flashing lights. Hours later, Ethan drifted in and out of a gray, painful consciousness in the sterile coldness of a hospital room. Tubes snaked from his arms. Machines beeped methodically around him. A doctor with kind eyes leaned over him, speaking words that seemed to swim in and out of focus. Severe cardiac episode, underlying condition, emergency surgery needed, expensive, critical window. But none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered. With a dry, cracked whisper, Ethan tugged weakly at the nurse's sleeve. "My dog," he rasped. "Please, I just want to see my dog." Before his voice broke off, the nurse bit her lip, glancing around uncertainly. "We'll see what we can do," she murmured, though the look in her eyes said it wasn't likely. As she stepped away, Ethan closed his eyes. In the endless gray behind his lids, he saw Rusty, young again, bounding through green fields under a wide Montana sky. A tear slid down Ethan's cheek. If this was the end, all he wanted, all he needed, was to say goodbye to the one soul who had loved him without question. Just one more moment, just one more time. The sterile white of the hospital ceiling stretched endlessly above Ethan, the buzzing fluorescent lights blurring into a cold, steady hum. He blinked slowly, feeling as if even that small motion drained him. His chest ached, not from the sharp pain of earlier, but a dull, heavy pressure, as though an invisible hand pressed down steadily, mercilessly on his ribs. Through the blur of medication and exhaustion, Ethan became aware of a presence near his bedside. A nurse, young, with a kind but weary face, checked his IV line, her touch efficient yet gentle. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, "you're awake. That's good." He tried to form words, but his throat was dry as sandpaper. She helped him sip a few drops of water, and after a few agonizing moments, his voice returned, a cracked whisper. "Rusty, my dog. Where is he?" The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to swoop in and reprimand her. "We're working on it," she said carefully. "Just rest for now, okay?" But Ethan couldn't rest. Every fiber of his being ached, not just from the failing of his body, but from the gnawing fear that he might never see Rusty again. What if Rusty was scared alone? What if Harris couldn't take him in? Ethan's heart rate spiked, setting off a shrill beep on the monitor. The nurse murmured calming words, adjusting the flow of his IV. Still, beneath the haze of drugs, a sharper, more primal panic thudded inside him. He had survived the heart attack. For now. But somewhere deep down, Ethan sensed the truth. This was only the beginning of a longer fight he might not be strong enough to win. 2 days later, Ethan sat propped up in bed, staring out the hospital window at the gray Montana winter pressing against the glass. He felt like a ghost, separated from life by a thin but impenetrable wall. Dr. Owens, the attending physician, entered the room with a thick file in hand. His expression was the professional kind, compassion mixed with detachment. "Ethan," he began, pulling a chair closer, "we've reviewed all your tests. You have an advanced form of cardiomyopathy. Your heart's muscle tissue is severely weakened." Ethan said nothing, merely nodded as if the words were being spoken about someone else. "You'll need surgery, soon. A bypass, maybe even a transplant down the line if things worsen. But even the initial surgery isn't cheap." Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't need the doctor to spell it out. No insurance, no savings, no family to lean on. Just him and Rusty. "What happens if I don't get it?" Ethan asked, voice low. Dr. Owens hesitated for just a beat. "You might have months, weeks, maybe less." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into a still lake, sending out ripples of dread. "But," the doctor added quickly, "there are programs, financial assistance, charity cases." Ethan cut him off with a small shake of his head. He knew how these things worked. Long waiting lists, endless paperwork, maybe a slim hope, for someone younger, healthier, not for a worn-out mechanic living paycheck to paycheck. "Thank you, Doc," Ethan said, managing a ghost of a smile. "Appreciate you shooting straight with me." Dr. Owens studied him, seeming to want to say more, but finally just patted Ethan's hand and left him to the snow in silence. That night, under the dim glow of the bedside lamp, Ethan made a decision, not out of despair, but out of love. He scribbled a note on the back of a diner receipt he found in his jacket pocket. "If anything happens to me, please take care of Rusty. He's a good boy. He deserves a good home." He folded it neatly and placed it on the nightstand, weighing it down with his worn leather wallet. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough, but it was all he could offer. He lay back against the pillows, hands resting on his chest, feeling the faint, unsteady beat of his own heart beneath them. Each thump a fragile thread tying him to the life he had built. Not much by the world's standards, but it was his. And somewhere out there, Rusty waited for him, trusting him. The thought cut deeper than any scalpel. The next morning, a commotion stirred down the hall. Voices raised, the scuffle of hurried footsteps. Ethan drifted in and out of wakefulness, catching only snatches of conversation. "Patient refuses surgery unless he sees his dog. Protocol? Liability? Someone needs to do something." Through it all, Ethan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the door. Hope flickered inside him, not bright enough to banish fear, but enough to keep breathing for one more hour, one more day. He thought about all the years Rusty had been there for him, the nights after Jenna's funeral, when he had broken down on the kitchen floor, the mornings he couldn't summon the will to get out of bed but did, because Rusty needed breakfast, the long, lonely winters made bearable by a warm body curled against his side. Rusty had saved him, more times than Ethan could count. Now it was Ethan's turn to fight, for just a little more time. Not for himself, for Rusty. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest brick building with a blue awning that read Clearwater Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Clara Mitchell was reading the local news app on her lunch break. The headline grabbed her immediately. "Dying mechanic's last wish is to see his dog one last time." She scrolled through the article, heart twisting with every line. A picture accompanied it, grainy, taken from outside the hospital. A man hooked to machines, with a golden retriever resting its head against the glass doors, unable to get in. Something deep, almost instinctive, stirred inside Clara. She knew that kind of love. She knew what it meant to need someone, to fight against impossible odds just for one more moment together. Without hesitation, she stood, grabbed her coat, and headed toward the door. Rules be damned. Some things were worth breaking the rules for, especially when it came to saving a heart, whether human or canine. The hospital room grew quieter with each passing hour, as if even time itself was tiptoeing around Ethan's bed, unwilling to disturb what little strength he had left. Outside the window, the world carried on. Cars zipped past on icy streets. Children bundled in thick coats laughed as they chased one another through falling snow. But inside, Ethan existed in a slow, heavy silence. He watched the snow drift down, his mind wandering back to memories blurred by fatigue and medication. Rusty as a puppy, all floppy ears and clumsy paws. Jenna's laughter echoing through their tiny kitchen. Sunday mornings fixing old cars just for the joy of it, not because he had bills to pay. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. A life warmer, fuller, a life that hadn't narrowed to the sterile four walls of this hospital room. A soft knock broke the silence. "Mr." Harris shuffled into the room, his old work jacket dusted with snow. His face, usually weathered but solid, looked worn and worried. "Hey, kid," Harris said, voice rougher than usual. "Brought you something." From behind his back, he pulled out an old faded photograph, a picture of Ethan and Rusty sitting in front of Walker's Auto Repair, smiling, their clothes and fur streaked with grease and dust. A snapshot from a life that now seemed achingly distant. Ethan's throat tightened as he took the photo, running a trembling finger over Rusty's image. "How's he doing?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Harris hesitated. "He's hanging in there, but he misses you, Ethan. Just lays by the door, waiting, like he knows you're fighting to come home." Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment, the pain sharper than any scalpel. "I don't know if I'm going to make it back, Harris," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Harris sat heavily in the chair beside him, his rough hands clenching and unclenching. "Listen, son, you're tougher than most. You've survived worse." Ethan gave a hollow chuckle. "I ain't tougher than a bad heart, old man." They sat in silence for a moment, the machines beeping steadily, counting each fragile second. Finally, Harris leaned forward, voice low but fierce. "You ain't alone in this, you hear me? We'll figure something out. You got people who care." Ethan wanted to believe him, but when he looked into Harris's eyes, he saw it, the same fear that lived in his own heart. Later that night, after Harris had left and the hallway lights dimmed into the hushed gloom of visiting hours, Ethan lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. He felt it then, not just the physical weakness, but the profound, aching loneliness. It wrapped around him tighter than the hospital blankets, squeezing the fight out of him. His chest hurt, but not just from the failing heart. It hurt because he realized he had spent too many years surviving, not living, working until his body broke down, carrying burdens he never dared share, locking away grief because there had never been time or permission to grieve. Now, on what could very well be the last stretch of his life, all he wanted was simple: to see Rusty, to tell him he was a good boy, to say goodbye. But even that seemed like too much to ask. The next morning, the doctors came. A team this time, 2 men in white coats and a woman with a clipboard, all speaking in the gentle, patronizing tones reserved for bad news. They outlined options: an emergency surgery Ethan couldn't afford, a charity program with a wait list months long, a possible transfer to a lower-cost facility 2 states over. None of it mattered. None of it touched the hollow ache inside him. "What happens if I just go home?" Ethan asked quietly. The woman with the clipboard pursed her lips. "You might not make it through the week," she said. Ethan nodded slowly, as if accepting the terms of a deal he hadn't agreed to in the first place. The team left, murmuring amongst themselves, and Ethan was alone again. Only this time, the loneliness wasn't cold. It burned. That afternoon, a hospital social worker came by, a kind-eyed man named Frank, offering pamphlets about hospice care, counseling services, and preparations. Preparations. As if he were just an old car being towed to the scrapyard. Frank paused at the foot of the bed, seeming to wrestle with something. Then he said, "I heard about your dog. Rusty, right? There's a woman who might be able to help. A vet, Dr. Mitchell. She's been asking questions." Ethan's heart stumbled against his ribs. "A vet?" he croaked. Frank smiled gently. "She's got a soft spot for cases like yours. Might be able to pull some strings." Hope, tiny and fragile, flickered in Ethan's chest. Maybe, just maybe, he would see Rusty again. Maybe he wouldn't have to say goodbye from behind a wall of glass and rules. As night fell and snow piled high on the hospital roof, Ethan lay back against his pillows, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. He didn't know if he would survive the week. He didn't know if Rusty would remember him when he finally saw him again. All he knew was that if love alone could keep a man alive, he would have lived forever. Because in that old dog's eyes, Ethan had always been enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that ever really mattered. The snow outside the hospital had thickened into a steady, silent blanket, softening the edges of the world. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed dully, casting long, tired shadows down the corridor where Dr. Clara Mitchell stood, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't planned on being here. Not today. Not for this. Yet something about the article she had read, the image of the aging golden retriever pressed against a hospital door, waiting with endless patience, had gripped her in a way she couldn't explain. Not logically, not professionally, emotionally. Deep down, she knew she wasn't just here for Rusty. She was here for the man who loved that dog enough to make him his last wish. Clara walked slowly toward the nurse's station, boots squeaking slightly against the polished tile. She smoothed down her coat, squared her shoulders, and flashed the badge she carried as a licensed veterinarian, stretching the limits of its authority as far as it would go. A young nurse glanced up, startled. "Can I help you?" "I'm here about Ethan Walker," Clara said, her voice steady but warm. "I heard he asked to see his dog. I'm A vet from Clearwater Clinic. I thought maybe I could assist. The nurse frowned. Hospital policy's strict. No animals inside unless they're registered therapy. I understand, Clara interrupted gently, but sometimes policies need a little compassion. The nurse hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously against the keyboard. He's in room 214, she said finally, dropping her voice. Technically, I didn't tell you that. Clara smiled, gratitude softening the lines of her face. You didn't. Without waiting for further objections, she moved down the hallway, her heart pounding a little harder with each step. Outside room 214, Clara paused. Through the small glass window, she saw him. Ethan Walker. He looked older than his 30-some years, the way hard lives often age a man. His hair was thick but unkempt, a dark brown threaded with early gray. His face, gaunt and unshaven, still held a quiet dignity. The kind born from years of doing the right thing even when no one was watching. A man who by all rights should have been surrounded by family, friends, the comforts he had earned. But he was alone. Clara's throat tightened. She saw with startling clarity pieces of herself reflected in that loneliness. Memories she had spent years locking away. The long hospital nights after her brother's accident. The empty house after the divorce. The way even the brightest rooms could feel unbearably cold when no one was waiting at home. Gathering her courage, she knocked softly and entered. Ethan turned his head toward the door, his movements sluggish. He blinked at her, confusion clouding his tired eyes. For a moment, Clara hesitated, realizing how much she must look like an intruder in this fragile space between hope and surrender. But then she smiled, a small, unthreatening curve of her lips, and stepped closer. Hi, Mr. Walker, she said softly. I'm Clara Mitchell. I'm a veterinarian here in town. Ethan struggled to sit up a little straighter. His voice was rough, threadbare. A vet? Yes, she said, pulling a chair closer. I read about you and Rusty. I want to help. At the sound of his dog's name, Ethan's eyes flickered with a faint light. But hospital rules, he rasped, his breath catching painfully. Clara leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Rules are important, she said, but sometimes love matters more. Ethan stared at her, a slow, incredulous smile touching his cracked lips for the first time in days. You'd really do that? I will do everything I can, Clara promised. No guarantees, but I have a few friends in low places. She winked, and to her relief, Ethan chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that still somehow filled the room with warmth. He's all I got, Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. Clara's heart clenched. She wanted to reach out, to take his hand, but held back, respecting the fragile dignity he clung to. I know, she said simply, and you deserve to see him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The machines beeped steadily. The snow pressed against the windows. Two strangers, bound by an understanding deeper than words. Later, as Clara slipped out of the room, her mind was already working. She would need clearance. She would need allies. She would need to move fast before the bureaucracy ground this tiny miracle into dust. At the nurse's station, she found the young nurse again, who gave her a tight, worried smile. You didn't hear it from me, the nurse said, voice low. But the evening shift supervisor, Mrs. Abernathy, she's got a soft spot for dogs. Maybe if someone explained how important this was. Clara nodded, gratitude swelling inside her. Thank you, she whispered. The nurse shrugged, eyes glinting. Sometimes you just gotta bend the world a little. Clara tucked the information away and headed for the exit. Outside, the wind had picked up, whipping the snow into chaotic flurries. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she climbed into her truck and turned the ignition. She had a call to make, a favor to pull, a promise to keep. Because sometimes, no matter how broken the world seemed, one small act of kindness could hold the pieces together just a little longer. The hospital corridor was almost empty by the time Clara returned, a worn duffel bag tucked discreetly under one arm. Inside it, nestled in a soft blanket, was a treasure more precious than any regulation or policy could ever account for. Rusty. The golden retriever poked his nose from the bag's opening, sniffing the sterile air with cautious curiosity. His tail gave a tentative wag, sensing something familiar in the otherwise unfamiliar space. Clara crouched beside him, stroking the fur between his ears. "You ready to be a rule breaker, old boy?" she whispered. Rusty leaned into her touch, his cloudy eyes shining with a trust so pure it squeezed Clara's heart. Together they made their way toward room 214, careful, quiet. Clara had already secured a verbal nod from Mrs. Abernathy, the night supervisor, under strict conditions. Be quick, be quiet, and be gone before morning rounds. As they approached the door, Rusty's body stiffened. His nose twitched wildly. He knew he could smell his person. Inside, Ethan lay half asleep, pain meds dulling the sharpest edges of his awareness, but doing nothing to soothe the hollow ache inside him. He thought he was dreaming when he heard the faint, familiar click of dog nails against linoleum. Then, a wet nose nudged his limp hand. Slowly, disbelievingly, Ethan turned his head. There he was, Rusty, not a dream, not a memory, real, solid, warm. Tears flooded Ethan's eyes faster than he could blink them away. "Rusty," he breathed, voice cracking like brittle glass. Rusty whined softly and, with a great effort, heaved himself up onto the edge of the hospital bed, draping his body across Ethan's chest with a care that belied his age. Ethan wrapped his arms around him as best he could, bearing his face into the dog's thick fur, inhaling the familiar smell of home, dust, sunshine, and loyalty. The machines around them beeped frantically for a moment, detecting the surge in Ethan's heart rate. A nurse peeked in, but seeing the scene, simply smiled and backed out, closing the door softly behind her. For a long, long while, neither man nor dog moved. They simply existed together, breathing, feeling, remembering. Rusty licked the tears from Ethan's cheeks, whimpering low in his throat, as if scolding him for ever doubting he would come. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. She had witnessed births, seen animals and humans alike cling to life against impossible odds. But there was something singular, something sacred about the bond between Ethan and Rusty. She hadn't just bent the rules tonight, she had witnessed a kind of resurrection. After a few minutes, Ethan looked up, his eyes finding Clara's through a shimmering blur of emotion. You did this?" he rasped. She nodded, her own throat too tight to trust her voice. Ethan reached out, fingers trembling, and clasped her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said, pouring everything he couldn't say into those two simple words. Clara squeezed back, feeling the silent weight of gratitude, grief, and hope pressing between them. Time seemed to lose meaning in that little room. Ethan whispered into Rusty's ear. Stories, promises, apologies for ever leaving him behind, though Rusty showed no sign he had ever doubted his master. Clara sat quietly nearby, giving them space, watching the clock only because she knew their time was limited. As the hours crept toward dawn, she finally stood, gently clearing her throat. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We have to go before the day shift comes in." "So," Ethan nodded slowly, understanding shining in his weary gaze. He patted Rusty's side. "Go with her, buddy. I'll be right behind you." Rusty resisted at first, whining, planting his heavy paws stubbornly against the mattress. But Clara coaxed him with soft words and steady hands, easing him back into the duffel bag, where he curled reluctantly, his nose poking out to keep Ethan in sight as long as possible. As Clara zipped the bag and slung it over her shoulder, Ethan whispered, almost too faintly to hear, "You gave me back my heart tonight." Clara paused, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. "You still have it," she said gently. "It just needed reminding why it beats." In the dim hallway, Clara carried Rusty toward the side exit, the old dog's head resting against her chest. She felt the thud of his heartbeat, slow, steady, unwavering. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and shimmering under a pale silver moon. For the first time in a long while, Clara smiled without reservation. Tonight, against the odds, love had won a small but vital victory, and somehow she knew it wouldn't be the last. Word count, Chapter 5, 1080 words. Morning crept over Clearwater Hospital, casting the snowy streets outside in a soft golden haze. Inside, life resumed its slow, mechanical rhythms, carts rattling down hallways, monitors beeping methodically, staff murmuring over fresh charts. But in room 214, something had shifted. Ethan woke with Rusty's warmth still lingering on his chest, even though the dog was gone now, safely back with Clara. For the first time in weeks, Ethan's heart beat not just to survive another day, but with a fragile, unfamiliar thing. Hope. He smiled to himself, a tired, cracked smile, but real. Outside his door, two nurses chatted in hushed tones, glancing toward his room with expressions that weren't just pity anymore. There was something else there now, a quiet kind of awe. Meanwhile, across town, at a little coffee shop called The Warm Mug, a young woman named Ellie Parks sat hunched over her laptop, nursing her second cup of strong black coffee. She had been the one who had snapped the photo 2 nights ago. Rusty pressed against the hospital doors, the caption reading simply, "A dying man's last wish, to say goodbye to his best friend." She hadn't expected much. Maybe a few sympathetic comments from neighbors, a couple of shares among the local Facebook groups. Instead, overnight, it had gone viral. By morning, the post had racked up over 300,000 shares, picked up by regional news outlets, then national ones. Clearwater, Montana, was suddenly on the map. Not for scandal, not for tragedy, but for something pure. Something people desperately needed to believe in. At the hospital, Clara checked her phone during a brief break. Dozens of notifications flooded her screen. Missed calls from reporters, interview requests, offers from animal welfare organizations wanting to help. She blinked, overwhelmed, before slowly smiling. Maybe, just maybe, this could become something bigger than a moment of kindness. Maybe it could become a movement. That afternoon, a news van rolled up outside the hospital, its logo emblazoned on the side. KMTV News, Montana's Voice. A young, eager reporter named Jenna Field stepped out into the crisp air, adjusting her scarf. She had chased plenty of hard stories in her short career, political corruption, violent storms, even a murder trial once. But something about this assignment felt different. It mattered. Inside, Jenna met with Frank, the hospital's social worker, who agreed to arrange a discreet interview with Ethan, only with his permission. When she entered Ethan's room, he looked up warily, clutching the photograph of him and Rusty that Mr. Harris had left behind. "I'm not much for cameras," Ethan rasped. Jenna smiled warmly, setting her notepad aside. "That's okay. I just want to tell your story. People need to hear it." Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to retreat into the safety of silence. But another part, the part that had fought for Rusty for just one more moment together, knew that maybe this was bigger than pride or privacy. Maybe this was about showing the world that love, real love, still existed. Even in forgotten garages, even in broken down bodies, even in a tired man and his old dog. "All right," he said quietly, "but make sure you tell it right." "I promise," Jenna said, voice steady, and so he told her. About Rusty, about losing Jenna, his wife, to a drunk driver all those years ago. About building a life from the wreckage. About the garage. About the nights Rusty curled against him when grief made it hard to breathe. About how sometimes when life broke you down to your barest bones, a dog's simple faith could stitch you back together. By evening, Ethan's story was everywhere. The hospital television flickered with images of him and Rusty. Online articles flooded social media feeds. Talk shows picked up the heartwarming narrative, weaving it between the usual grim headlines. The mechanic and his dog, a love stronger than death. When all else failed, loyalty endured. A small town's big reminder of what matters most. Messages poured in from across the country and beyond. Offers to pay for Ethan's surgery. Letters from veterans who spoke of their service dogs saving their lives. Children sending hand-drawn pictures of Ethan and Rusty, scribbled in crayon and bright hope. It was as if, in a world frayed by anger and uncertainty, people had found in Ethan's quiet resilience a lighthouse against the storm. Late that night, Clara returned to the hospital, Rusty trotting loyally beside her on a makeshift leash. She found Ethan awake, watching the news coverage with a stunned expression. "Looks like you're famous," Clara teased, stepping inside. Ethan shook his head slowly, still dazed. "I never wanted this." "I know," she said, settling into the chair by his bed. "But maybe the world needed it." Rusty jumped up, placing his paws gently on Ethan's lap, eliciting a genuine laugh, a sound so rich and warm it made Clara's throat tighten. For the first time since he had collapsed in that frigid garage, Ethan didn't feel like a burden. He felt seen, valued, needed. Not because he was extraordinary, but because the ordinary, everyday love he had lived, quiet, patient, unwavering, was itself extraordinary. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it was everything. The days that followed blurred into a surreal, dreamlike haze for Ethan. He remained confined to the hospital bed, the IV drip feeding him a steady trickle of medications. But outside those sterile walls, his world was changing faster than he could comprehend. Cards arrived first, handwritten notes from strangers across the country, tucked into colorful envelopes that smelled faintly of lavender, peppermint, and 1,000 unseen kitchens. Then came care packages. Books, hand-knitted scarves, homemade dog treats for Rusty. Some were from people who had lost loved ones, others from those who simply believed that no man should leave this world alone. The hospital staff, usually brisk and professional, now lingered by his bedside longer, offering smiles and small jokes, treating him not just as a patient, but as someone who mattered. And through it all, Rusty remained a faithful fixture, granted special dispensation to visit daily under Clara's careful watch. Every time Ethan opened his eyes to see Rusty's graying face resting on the mattress beside him, he felt a little more tethered to this life, a little less ready to let go. One crisp afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the frost-speckled window, Frank, the hospital social worker, entered with a wide grin Ethan hadn't seen before. "You've got a visitor," Frank said, stepping aside to reveal a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed but with a ruggedness that hinted at humble beginnings. "Ethan Walker?" the man said, stepping forward, extending a hand. Ethan, struggling with the stiffness of inactivity, managed to grasp it weakly. "That's me. Name's James Turner," the man said, settling into the chair beside Ethan's bed. "Founder of the Hearts United Foundation." Ethan blinked, the name vaguely familiar from one of the many articles people had read aloud to him. "I saw your story," James continued. "Reminded me of my old man. He was a mechanic, too. Worked his fingers to the bone to put food on the table. Never asked for anything. Never got much, either." He paused, his eyes softening. "I started Hearts United because of him. To make sure people like him, like you, don't get forgotten." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but James lifted a hand, forestalling him. "We're covering your surgery," James said simply. "Every cent, no strings attached." For a long, suspended moment, Ethan could only stare at him, heart pounding so hard it set the monitor beeping wildly. "Why me?" Ethan finally croaked, his voice thick with disbelief. James smiled. "Because sometimes the world needs a reminder that ordinary goodness deserves extraordinary kindness." Later, after James left to coordinate the logistics with the hospital, Clara slipped in, finding Ethan staring out the window, Rusty's head resting heavily on his lap. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Clara teased gently. Ethan turned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his eyes weren't full of resignation. They sparkled with something close to life. "I'm getting the surgery," he said, the words still tasting like a miracle on his tongue. Clara smiled, a slow, luminous thing that made the room feel warmer. "That's wonderful, Ethan." He hesitated, his hand absently stroking Rusty's fur. "I don't know how to repay it. Any of it," he admitted. "You don't," Clara said softly, pulling the chair closer. "Sometimes you just accept the gift, and maybe someday you pass it forward." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of years of silent endurance starting at last to lift from his shoulders. Maybe survival wasn't just about gritting your teeth through pain. Maybe it was about allowing yourself to be saved sometimes too. The surgery was scheduled for 3 days later. Preparations began almost immediately. Tests, scans, consultations. The hospital bustled around Ethan with a sense of urgent optimism, as if everyone who had watched his story unfold now felt personally invested in his success. Clara visited every day, sometimes with Rusty in tow, sometimes just sitting quietly beside him, reading aloud from books the hospital chaplain had brought, stories about hope, resilience, redemption. They didn't talk much about the risks, About the fact that Ethan's heart was so damaged that even with surgery, nothing was guaranteed. They chose instead to talk about Rusty's favorite lake near town, about the garage Ethan used to dream of owning, about second chances. Because now, for the first time, second chances seemed not like a cruel joke, but a real possibility. On the night before the surgery, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, Rusty curled at his side, listening to the soft hum of machines, the distant sounds of a hospital settling into midnight quiet. He thought about all the things he had missed chasing broken cars and overdue bills. The sunsets, the birthday cakes, the phone calls not made because pride had gotten in the way. If he made it through tomorrow, he promised himself, he would live differently. Not just survive, live. He would fix up the garage properly. He would take Rusty to that lake again, let him wade into the cool water and shake droplets everywhere like he used to. He would find a way to give back, to be the kind of light someone else could follow home. Tears welled up in his eyes and he buried his face into Rusty's fur, breathing in the scent of old wood smoke and sun-warmed earth. "I'm gonna fight, boy," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm gonna fight for you. For us." Rusty let out a soft, contented huff, as if he understood. Maybe he did. After all, some things didn't need words. Some promises were written straight onto the heart. The morning of the surgery dawned cold and still, a pale mist clinging to the streets of Clearwater like a breath held in suspense. Inside the hospital, the world shrank to a series of measured steps: preparation, transport, incision. Ethan lay in the pre-op room, a thin cotton blanket drawn up to his chest, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm beneath it. Machines beeped steadily beside him, nurses moved with gentle efficiency, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something heavier: fear. He wasn't a man easily rattled. Years of scraped knuckles and broken engines had taught him patience, endurance. But this was different, because this time he wasn't fighting for another day on the job. He was fighting for every sunrise he had yet to see, for every walk with Rusty, for every second chance he hadn't dared hope for. Clara appeared in the doorway, her white coat traded for a simple sweater and jeans, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Her presence alone eased some of the tightness winding through Ethan's chest. "Hey," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. "How are you feeling?" Ethan managed a crooked smile. "Like I'm about to get hit by a freight train." Clara chuckled, but her eyes were serious. She reached out, covering his calloused hand with her smaller one. "You're strong, Ethan. Stronger than you know." He swallowed hard, emotion prickling behind his eyes. "You'll be here when I wake up." "I'll be right here," she promised. "And so will Rusty." At the sound of his dog's name, Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. "Tell him." His voice cracked, and he had to start again. "Tell him I'm coming back." "You can tell him yourself," Clara said, her voice thick with feeling. "He's waiting." Minutes later, they wheeled Ethan down the corridor, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the gurney's wheels squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. He caught glimpses as he passed: nurses offering small waves, Mr. Harris standing at the end of the hall, hat clutched in his weathered hands, a handful of strangers who had come to know him through whispered stories and television screens. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing in deep. When he opened them again, the bright lights of the operating room greeted him, blinding and cold. A masked figure leaned over him, voice calm and practiced. "Mr. Walker, we're going to count backward now. Just relax." Ethan stared up into the white, endless ceiling. For Rusty, for Clara, for himself. He let go. Hours later, in a world blurred by anesthesia and stitched with pain, Ethan surfaced slowly. The first thing he became aware of was the dull ache in his chest. Sharp, raw, but alive. Alive. The second was the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. A strong beat, a new beat. Tears slipped unbidden from the corners of his eyes, wetting the pillow beneath his head. He had made it. Somewhere above him, voices murmured. Nurses, doctors, someone adjusting his IV. And then, a familiar weight, soft fur brushing his arm, a wet nose nudging his hand. Rusty. Ethan cracked open his eyes, blurry but determined, and saw the golden retriever sitting dutifully by his side, eyes locked onto his face as if willing him to heal faster. Clara's face hovered just behind Rusty's shoulder, smiling so brightly it outshone the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, too raw. So he just squeezed her hand and let the tears fall freely, knowing for once he didn't have to hide them. The recovery was slow, measured in inches rather than miles. Each day, Ethan pushed himself a little further, sitting up, swinging his legs over the bed, standing with shaky knees. Rusty remained his constant companion, curling up beside the bed during therapy sessions, wagging his tail encouragingly whenever Ethan managed another step. Clara visited daily too, sometimes bringing sandwiches smuggled from the local deli, sometimes bringing nothing but her steady, reassuring presence. They talked about everything and nothing. The best fishing spots outside Clearwater, the worst car breakdowns Ethan had ever fixed, the time Clara had rescued an entire litter of kittens from a drainage pipe during a thunderstorm. Through those quiet conversations, a tentative thread spun between them, something delicate but unbreakable. Not just gratitude, not just friendship, something more. Something beginning to bloom with the slow, sure patience of spring after a brutal winter. One crisp afternoon, 2 weeks after the surgery, Ethan was cleared to leave the hospital. Mr. Harris arrived with Ethan's battered old truck, now polished within an inch of its life, and Clara stood beside him, Rusty bouncing excitedly at her feet. Ethan stepped through the hospital doors slowly, feeling the cool air kiss his cheeks, breathing in the scent of pine and snow. Home. He was going home, not to the same life he had left behind, beaten and broken, but to something new, something hard-won. He glanced at Clara, who offered him a smile full of encouragement and something deeper, something that made Ethan's heart, the new one beating strong within his chest, stutter for a different reason entirely. "Ready?" she asked. Ethan looked down at Rusty, who barked once, tail wagging furiously. He laughed, a full, rich sound, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." Spring unfurled slowly over Clearwater, the snow retreating from the streets in shy patches, the trees budding with cautious green. Life, it seemed, was tentatively beginning again, not just outside, but within Ethan too. Each morning, he woke with Rusty sprawled beside him, the old dog snoring contentedly. Each day he found himself moving a little easier, breathing a little deeper, laughing a little more freely. It wasn't perfect. His body still ached. His energy flagged before noon some days. But compared to the hollow ache he had carried for so long, this was life reborn. One Saturday morning, Ethan sat on the front porch of his small rented house sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. Rusty lay at his feet, nose twitching at the scent of the warming earth. A pickup truck pulled up by the curb, sleek, new, out of place on their worn street. The driver's door opened and James Turner stepped out, dressed casually this time, jeans, boots, a leather jacket. Ethan squinted against the sun, shading his eyes. "Mr. Turner," he called, "what brings you out here?" James smiled, crossing the yard with easy strides. "Just James," he said, "and I come bearing a proposition." Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious but wary. "Mind if I sit? Be my guest." James settled onto the top step, stretching out his legs. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, watching Rusty chase a drifting leaf with lazy enthusiasm. Then James turned, his expression serious but kind. "You ever think about going back to work?" he asked. Ethan chuckled, a dry sound. "Doc says I gotta take it slow. Can't exactly throw engines around like I used to." James nodded thoughtfully. "Not talking about busting your back. I'm talking about something different, something bigger." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, handing it to Ethan. Inside were papers, deeds, business proposals, blueprints. Ethan's heart thudded as he scanned them. A garage. Not just any garage, his own. Fully outfitted, modernized, located just outside downtown Clearwater on a property James's foundation had recently acquired. "The Hearts United Foundation wants to invest in community rebuilding," James explained. "Places where people can work, learn, find purpose again. I figured, who better to run a place like that than a man who's already lived the hardest parts of life?" Ethan stared at the papers, disbelieving. You're offering me a business? I'm offering you a future, James said simply. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. The old part of him, the part worn thin by years of scraping by, of believing good things were for other people, wanted to refuse, to say it was too much, too soon. But another part, the part that had survived against all odds, that had learned to hope again, whispered something different. Maybe this was what second chances looked like. Messy, unexpected, terrifying, and beautiful. Later that evening, after James had left with a handshake and a promise to give Ethan time to think, Clara stopped by with takeout. She found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, the folder spread open before him, Rusty's head resting heavily on his knee. "Looks serious," she said, setting down a bag that smelled gloriously of fried chicken. Ethan looked up, a dazed smile on his face. "You're looking at the newest potential business owner in Clearwater," he said, half joking, half incredulous. Clara's eyes widened, then lit up with genuine delight. "That's amazing, Ethan. Tell me everything." Over greasy chicken legs and shared laughter, he explained James's offer. Clara listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she leaned forward, her voice steady. "You deserve this," she said simply. "All of it." Ethan swallowed hard, emotions knotting in his chest. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice low. "What if I mess it up?" Clara smiled gently. "You won't. You've already survived things most people couldn't even imagine. Building a new life? You were made for it." Rusty thumped his tail against the floor in agreement, as if seconding her vote of confidence. Ethan laughed, the sound rusty but real. Maybe fear wasn't the enemy after all. Maybe it was the sign that he was stepping into something bigger than survival, into something that could truly be called living. That night, long after Clara had left and the house had fallen silent save for Rusty's soft snoring, Ethan sat alone with the folder in his lap. He traced his fingers over the blueprints, imagining the garage bustling with neighbors, apprentices learning the trade, old cars finding new life, a place not just to fix engines, a place to fix hearts, including his own. With a deep breath, Ethan picked up the pen resting nearby. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness now, but from the sheer, overwhelming gravity of choosing life. And then, with a steady stroke, he signed his name. The grand opening of Walker's Garage wasn't grand in the traditional sense. There were no banners, no television crews, no blaring speeches. Just a simple hand-painted sign hung over the bay doors. Walker's Garage, pay what you can, or pay it forward. And yet somehow that humble sign drew more people than any billboard could have. By mid-morning, cars lined the dusty street outside. Some were old trucks held together by duct tape and hope. Others were better off but had stories just as worn. Inside, Ethan moved carefully but steadily, his new heart ticking away with quiet strength beneath his ribs. He wore a faded denim shirt and the same rugged boots he had used for years, symbols of who he was and who he had become. Rusty, now an unofficial shop mascot, lounged happily on a patched dog bed in the corner, tail thumping every time someone approached. Ethan spent the day greeting customers, shaking hands and fixing what he could. Some people couldn't pay more than a few dollars. Some insisted on overpaying. All left lighter than when they arrived. He worked alongside volunteers, high school kids eager to learn, retired mechanics itching to keep busy, neighbors who wanted to be part of something good. Every turn of a wrench, every friendly conversation over a busted carburetor seemed to stitch the town a little closer together. Ethan wasn't just fixing engines, he was repairing hope. One afternoon, Clara stopped by carrying a brown paper bag filled with sandwiches and lemonade. She leaned against the doorway, watching him work with a quiet smile. "You look good out there," she said when Ethan finally took a break. He wiped grease from his hands and grinned. "Feels good," he admitted. "Feels right." Clara handed him a sandwich, their fingers brushing briefly, an electric, almost shy touch. "You built more than a garage here," she said, her voice soft. "You built a family." Ethan looked around. The laughter, the smell of oil and fresh bread, Rusty rolling over for belly rubs, and felt it too. A family, not of blood, but of choice, of kindness, of second chances. As the weeks passed, Walker's Garage became more than just a local curiosity. Word spread through neighboring towns. A place where no one was turned away because they couldn't afford help. A place where dignity was repaired right alongside broken engines. One day, an older woman named Mrs. Harper brought in a battered sedan, barely held together by paint and prayer. Her husband had passed 6 months earlier, leaving her a mountain of bills and a leaking radiator. Ethan and his crew patched it up, refusing payment. Instead, they handed her a cup of coffee and asked her about the love story behind the car. She left with tears in her eyes and a smile on her lips. The first in months, she said. Another day, a teenage boy named Caleb, whose father had lost his job at the mill, showed up asking for work. Ethan took him under his wing, teaching him how to change oil, replace brake pads, troubleshoot an engine. Each lesson was more than mechanical. It was a message. You matter. Your future matters. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised golds and purples, Ethan sat on the porch of the garage with Clara beside him and Rusty snoring at their feet. They watched the town glow under the first stars, the garage lights still burning warmly behind them, casting long, welcoming shadows. "You ever think it'd turn out like this?" Clara asked, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. Ethan chuckled, a deep, easy sound. "Not in a million years," he said. "I thought my story was over." She turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft light. It was just beginning. Their eyes met, steady, unflinching, and for the first time, Ethan didn't look away. He saw a future there, a future built not on what had been lost, but on what had been found. In the distance, a bell above the garage door jingled as someone new walked in, seeking help, seeking hope. Ethan stood slowly, joints creaking in protest, and held out a hand to Clara. "Come on," he said, grinning. "Let's go fix something." She took his hand without hesitation. Together, they stepped back into the light. The warmth of early summer settled over Clearwater, coaxing the wildflowers into bloom along the dusty roads and filling the air with the scent of new beginnings. At Walker's garage, business thrived, not in the noisy, bustling way of big city shops, but in the quiet, steady rhythm that spoke of trust, hard-earned and deeply kept. Ethan found himself busier than he had been in years, but it was a different kind of busy, not survival, something gentler, something that made each day feel less like a battle and more like a blessing. And yet, despite the healing in his body, there were scars that ran deeper than any scalpel could reach. Scars that even the strongest hands couldn't mend alone. One evening, after the last car had rumbled away and the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Ethan and Clara sat on the old swing bench outside the garage. Rusty lay sprawled between them, snoring softly, his tail twitching in some happy dream. For a long time they said nothing, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that only comes when two people have begun to stitch their lives quietly around each other. Then Clara spoke, her voice low. "Do you ever think about the before?" she asked. "Before all of this?" Ethan tilted his head, considering. "Yeah," he admitted. "Some nights it hits me. How close I came to missing all this." He paused, the memories sharp. Icy floors, flashing ambulance lights, the weight of finality pressing down on his chest. "I spent so long just getting by," he said slowly. "Didn't even realize how much life I was letting slip past me." Clara nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I know the feeling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After my divorce, after losing my brother, I thought healing meant pretending none of it hurt, keeping busy, moving forward. But I wasn't really living, just floating." Ethan turned to her, truly seeing her for the first time beyond the kind smile and steady hands. He saw the quiet grief she carried like a second skin. He saw the strength it took for her to sit there and speak the truth out loud. "Floating gets lonely," he said gently. Clara smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "It does." The porch light flickered on above them, moths dancing in its warm halo. The night air smelled of cut grass and engine oil, a scent that, to Ethan, now meant home. He took a slow breath, heart thudding steadily, the beat no longer frantic but full. "You know," he said, voice rough with unspoken things, "for a long time, I thought the only thing keeping me going was Rusty." Clara reached down, ruffling the sleeping dog's ears. "He's a good reason," she said softly. Ethan smiled, a small, crooked thing that deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes. "But lately, he continued, looking directly at her now. I think maybe it's more than that. Clara met his gaze without flinching, something raw and open flickering between them. Hope. Not the wild, reckless kind, the slow, steady kind that took root when you weren't looking. The kind that grew strong enough to bear the weight of real love. I'm scared, Ethan admitted, the words tasting strange but right. Me too, Clara whispered. And just like that, the distance between them melted away, not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with the simple, sacred act of telling the truth, of choosing to stand, scars and all, in the bare light of vulnerability. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the enormity of the moment, and Clara met him halfway, their fingers twining together, imperfect but sure. For a long time they sat that way, the evening wrapping around them like a benediction. Rusty stirred once, his head lifting briefly to look at them, as if approving of the new shape their lives were taking, before settling back into sleep. Later, under a sky freckled with stars, they walked side by side down the quiet streets of Clearwater. Ethan spoke of Jenna, his late wife, not with the bitterness of grief, but with the tenderness of memory. Clara spoke of her brother, of dreams unfinished, of the weight of guilt she had carried for too long. They didn't promise each other forever. They didn't need to. It was enough for now to walk the same road, shoulder to shoulder, hearts beating in time. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something beautiful in spite of it. Maybe even because of it. And for the first time, Ethan truly believed he could. As they returned to the garage, the town quiet around them, Ethan glanced at Clara, a soft smile playing at his lips. Tomorrow, he said, we'll start fresh. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. No, she said gently. We already have. The first snow of the season drifted down like a soft benediction over Clearwater, frosting rooftops and blanketing the mountains in a shimmering hush. At Walker's garage, the windows glowed warmly against the early darkness, and inside, laughter echoed off the high ceilings as Ethan tightened the last bolt on an old Ford truck. Rusty lay on his favorite rug nearby, his breathing slow but steady, his muzzle now almost entirely white. Time had left its fingerprints on him, on all of them, but there was no sadness in it, only gratitude, only love. That night, after the garage closed and the last customer drove away into the snowy dusk, Ethan and Clara lingered. The radio played softly in the background, a crooning old country tune, while Rusty dozed between them. He's slowing down, Clara said gently, her hand resting lightly over Ethan's. Ethan nodded, his heart tugging painfully but peacefully. I know, he said, but he's had a good run. A better run than most. A run filled with loyalty, with second chances, with sunrises shared on dusty porches and quiet prayers whispered into thick fur. Rusty had lived and loved without reservation, and now Ethan knew it was almost time to return that gift with the same grace. As the evening deepened, the three of them moved into the little house behind the garage, the home Ethan had spent the last few months repairing, just as he had been repairing himself. Clara built a fire in the stone hearth, the flames casting a golden glow that danced across the worn wooden floors. Ethan settled Rusty onto a thick quilt near the fireplace, carefully tucking a pillow beneath the dog's graying head. Rusty thumped his tail weakly, offering a sleepy sigh that spoke of utter contentment. Clara brought mugs of tea, and together she and Ethan sat on the floor beside him, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. They talked in low voices about simple things. The holiday festival the town was planning, the young apprentice Caleb, who had just earned his first mechanic's certification, the way the town had begun to knit itself closer around the humble garage at the edge of town. The future stretched before them, not flashy or grand, but solid and real. Ethan leaned back against the couch, feeling Rusty's slow breaths rise and fall against his thigh. I used to think, Ethan said quietly, that Rusty needed me. Clara looked at him, her eyes warm and steady. And now? Ethan smiled, a deep, quiet thing. Now I know I needed him more. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow muffled the world into silence. Ethan leaned down, pressing a kiss to Rusty's forehead, his voice rough with love. You can rest now, buddy, he whispered. You did good. Rusty's tail gave one last, slow wag, a final thank you, a final I love you. And then, with a soft, shuddering breath, he slipped away, cradled by warmth, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world. There were tears, of course, tears that burned and healed all at once. Clara curled against Ethan's side, her arms around him as he wept, not in despair, but in profound, aching gratitude. Rusty had carried him through the darkest valleys, had stayed when so much else had fallen away. And now, even in his leaving, he left a gift, a life rebuilt, a heart reborn, a man who knew at last that love was not something you lost. It was something you carried forward, always. A few days later, on a bright, cold morning, the entire town gathered at the small park on the hill overlooking Clearwater. They planted a tree there, a strong young oak, and at its base a simple plaque, in memory of Rusty, the goodest boy who taught us all how to love without fear. Ethan stood with Clara at his side, surrounded by friends and neighbors, watching as Rusty's legacy took root in the rich earth. The wind stirred the branches above, and for a moment Ethan swore he could feel a warm nose bumping against his hand, a reminder that he was never truly alone. Clara squeezed his hand, her touch anchoring him. Together they walked back down the hill, the town spread out before them like a promise. The road ahead wasn't guaranteed. There would be hardships, there would be heartaches, but there would also be sunrises, and laughter, and love. The kind that carried you through every storm, the kind that left its mark not in scars, but in the lives you touched, the hearts you healed simply by being there. As Ethan glanced at Clara, Rusty's tree standing tall behind them against the winter sky, he smiled, a real, full smile. One chapter had ended, but another, brighter, richer, infinitely more beautiful, had just begun. And this time, he was ready for all of it. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share a little piece of your story with us. It's always a joy to see how far kindness and hope can reach. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more heartwarming stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing family. Your support means the world and helps us continue bringing you stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Until next time, may your days be filled with kindness, love, and unexpected miracles.